Imagine waking up at 3 a.m. in a dimly lit nursing home room. The air feels heavy and still. My 93-year-old father suddenly bolts upright in his bed, eyes wide with shock, because a door that had never existed before just materialized on the plain wall right beside him. A soft, unnatural glow leaks from its edges. Out step 3, sometimes 5, short men, each one no taller than 5 feet tall. They wear strange, old-fashioned garments that no living person in our world has ever worn. Their voices murmur in a language my father has never heard, soft, urgent, completely foreign. They move without a single footstep sound, gliding silently from bed to bed, carefully checking the patients who are lying closest to death. Their presence feels heavy, like the weight of final judgment. 2 nights later, the patient they had gathered around passed away quietly in the early hours. This wasn't the first time the dead had come looking for my father. In fact, the ghosts had been following him quietly through his entire long life, from the time he was a frightened boy until his very last breath. It all began when he was just a scared 13-year-old boy, working alone in a remote Cambodian grain factory that had been built directly on top of an old, forgotten graveyard. My father's name was John. He lived a tough, challenging life full of hardship, but the unseen world never left him alone. Tonight I'm going to share the 5 most terrifying times the other side reached out and touched his life. Stay with me, because what happened at the end will stay with you. John was born in Cambodia. His family was very poor, so when he was only 13 years old, he had to leave home to find work. He ended up in a remote grain factory far out in the countryside outside Phnom Penh, a place where they refined grains and stored crops. The work was long and exhausting, 6 full days a week under the hot, humid sun. At night, all the young boys slept together in a simple 1-floor dormitory, 6 single beds arranged in 2 rows, with the heads of the beds pushed against the wall. Sundays were their only precious day off. Most of the other boys would leave to visit relatives who lived nearby. But John had no family close by, so on his very first weekend alone, he decided to stay behind in the empty dormitory and rest. Saturday evening arrived. One by one, all the other boys packed up and left. By nightfall, John was completely alone in that big, silent room. The Cambodian countryside nights are incredibly loud and alive. Constant croaking of frogs, chirping of crickets, buzzing insects, and the distant calls of unknown animals. Because snakes were a real danger in that area, John did what all the workers always did. He carefully sprinkled sulfur powder all around the outside walls of the dormitory to keep them away. He went to bed early, around 8 p.m., feeling the weight of the lonely weekend ahead. Then, deep in the middle of the night, the dormitory door suddenly banged open with a violent, explosive crash that echoed through the empty room. John's eyes flew open in terror. There, silhouetted in the doorway, stood a tall, pitch-black shadow figure, holding a thick, heavy black club in its hand. Without hesitation, the shadow moved forward and slammed the club down onto the first empty bed with a deafening bang that shook the wooden frame. Then it moved to the second bed. Bang. Third bed. Bang. Fourth bed. The sound getting closer and louder with every step. John was lying in the innermost bed, his heart hammering so violently he could barely breathe. Sweat poured down his face. The black shadow kept advancing slowly, deliberately, as if it knew exactly where he was. In pure panic, he didn't stop to think. He rolled off his bed as fast as he could and scrambled desperately to the far side of the room, pressing himself against the wall. The shadow reached his now empty bed and brought the heavy club crashing down with a final, thunderous crack that split the silence. John was trembling, panting, drenched in sweat, frozen in absolute terror. He could not believe what his eyes had just witnessed. And then, just like that, the black shadow simply dissolved and vanished into thin air, leaving nothing behind. That night, John refused to stay in the dormitory any longer. He ran through the darkness to another building where other workers were sleeping and spent the rest of the night there, wide awake. The next morning, he finally learned the horrifying truth from the locals. That entire factory had been constructed on the site of an old, unmarked graveyard, a resting place for many unknown souls who had never received proper burials or respect. Shaken to his core, John quit the job immediately and left the factory for good. But even though he escaped that place, the ghosts were far from finished with him. Many years passed. John was now in his 30s, working steadily as an electrician and training 2 young apprentices. One ordinary lunch hour, both apprentices had gone out to eat. John stayed behind alone to finish fixing an electrical connection point in the workshop. One of the connection points had not been properly wrapped with insulating rubber tape beforehand. A small but deadly mistake. The instant John's hand touched the exposed wire, a powerful surge of electricity locked his body in place. He couldn't pull away. He couldn't even scream. His muscles were completely frozen by the current. Right in front of his eyes, a vivid, swirling, colorful spiral appeared. Beautiful shades of blue, purple, and gold twisting and pulling at him like a living vortex. In that terrifying moment, his entire life flashed before him in rapid, crystal-clear replay. Every childhood memory, every hardship, every happy moment with his young wife and children. It all rushed past in seconds. Deep down, he understood with absolute clarity. If he let himself fall into that beautiful spiral, no matter how peaceful and inviting it looked, it would mean the end of his life on this earth. He had a young wife and small children who depended on him completely. He could not abandon them. He refused to die. So he fought with every ounce of willpower he had left, mentally screaming at himself to hold on just a few more seconds. Then, by some miracle, one of the apprentices returned early from lunch, immediately realized what was happening, and rushed to switch off the main power. The current stopped. John collapsed to the floor, completely drained and exhausted. They hurried him to a nearby medical clinic for a full checkup. Miraculously, he was physically okay, but the experience left a permanent mark on his soul. When he finally told my mother the full story later that evening, she turned pale with shock and pleaded with him to be far more careful in his work from then on. He had stared death in the face, and the other side had given him a vivid warning. Another 20 years went by. John and my mother traveled from Macau all the way to the quiet countryside near Shantou City in mainland China. My grandmother had become seriously ill and decided to move back to her roots there. They stayed with her for a few nights in her simple, traditional one-floor village house. The first night passed peacefully with nothing unusual, but on the second night, At precisely 3 a.m. in the dead of night, John was jolted awake by an incredibly loud, chaotic background noise coming from right outside the front door. It sounded exactly like a bustling outdoor marketplace in full swing. Dozens of voices, haggling and bargaining over prices, people shouting, goods being carried and dropped, footsteps shuffling on the ground, the general hum of a busy crowd. He lay there confused, thinking he must still be half dreaming. After all, who would possibly open a market at 3 in the morning in a quiet rural village? The noise grew louder and more intense, becoming almost unbearable. Unable to ignore it any longer, he reluctantly got dressed, walked to the door, and swung it open to see what was happening. Nothing. Absolute empty darkness and stillness. Just the usual quiet countryside view. No people, no stalls, no lights, no voices. Not a single sound remained. A deep chill ran straight down John's spine. He stood there stunned and confused, unable to reconcile the loud marketplace crowd he had clearly heard only seconds earlier with the total emptiness in front of him now. Shaken, he quickly closed the door, hurried back to bed, and tried to force himself back to sleep. The next morning, he quietly told my mother what had happened. She became frightened too. They chose not to mention it to my grandmother, not wanting to scare her in her fragile condition. My grandmother passed away peacefully not long after that visit. To this day, our family has always wondered. Perhaps the house was already surrounded by restless spirits. Maybe she had already begun to join that ghostly nighttime crowd and would never fully return to her room again. If these stories are giving you chills so far, hit the like button. It really helps more people discover real ghost encounters like this. By the time John reached his 90s, his body had grown much weaker from high blood pressure and heart disease, though he could still take care of himself at home with my mother's help. One ordinary late evening, while he was relaxing and watching television in the bedroom, a ghostly figure suddenly materialized right there in the room without any warning. It was a young lady wearing a flowing, traditional red robe. Her long, jet-black hair completely covered her face. No eyes visible, no mouth, just an eerie blankness where her features should have been. John was startled but kept his composure. He looked directly at the apparition and said in a firm voice, "What are you doing here? Get out right now." The faceless woman in red seemed genuinely surprised, almost taken aback, as if she had not expected any living person to be able to see her clearly. A moment later, she simply faded away and disappeared. Later, I explained to my father, "When you were younger and full of strength, your yang energy, the positive, living energy, was so powerful that spirits couldn't easily appear to you. But now, as your body has grown weaker and your yin energy has increased, you are beginning to see what has always been there." Perhaps the ghost did not appreciate being shouted at and ordered away. The very next day, after finishing lunch, John was folding a small table when he suddenly lost his balance and fell backwards heavily onto the floor, as if something had grabbed his legs. The impact fractured his pelvis badly. Doctors examined him and immediately ruled out surgery. The risk was too high because of existing ulcers in his blood vessels. Any operation could cause fatal internal bleeding. With no other options, John had to move into an elderly care home so his pelvis could heal slowly and naturally over time. Once settled in the care home, the visions returned even more clearly. After midnight, almost every night, a mysterious door would appear on the plain wall near his bed. A door that definitely wasn't part of the building during the day. From inside that doorway emerged the same short men, 3 to 5 of them, dressed in those otherworldly clothes, speaking softly in their unknown language. They stood only about 5 feet tall. They moved quietly and methodically from bed to bed, examining the patients who were in the most critical condition. One particular night, they gathered together around the bed of an elderly man suffering from severe kidney failure. They stood there for some time, observing him closely. Just 2 days later, that man passed away. The same pattern repeated with several other patients who were near the end. John observed everything with a calm, almost accepting expression, as if these visitations had nothing directly to do with fear for himself. And it seemed that among all other patients, only he could see those short men. He even described the short men in detail to the relatives visiting the patient in the next bed. Those relatives became visibly terrified by what he told them. A few days later, that patient also passed away. One evening, John had an unusually long and heartfelt conversation with my mother. He spoke warmly about all the years they had shared, recounting stories from their life together, and thanked her sincerely for every sacrifice and effort she had made for the family. My mother found the conversation a little strange and unusually reflective, but she didn't dwell on it at the time. Early the following morning, after eating a light breakfast, John passed away peacefully in his sleep. When my younger sister arrived first at the care home, she found his body. He was lying there with a gentle smile on his face. Perhaps in those final moments, he had already seen those short men gathering quietly around his own bed, discussing his departure, and he was ready to go with them. But he decided not to tell my mom for fear of scaring her. My father's life had been filled with difficulties right from the start. Poverty, early separation from family, dangerous work, a serious near-death accident, and 5 distinct encounters with the spirit world across nearly a century. Yet through it all, he faced everything with quiet strength. In the end, he wasn't afraid of the ghosts that had followed him. He simply smiled. As he had requested, his body was cremated and his ashes were scattered in the peaceful garden reserved for that purpose. Most people go through their entire lives without ever catching a glimpse of what lies beyond. My father saw it clearly, time and time again. And when the time finally came, the ghosts didn't drag him away. He simply walked with them. If you have ever had your own personal experience with the other side, whether it was a shadow, a voice, a feeling, or something more, please share it honestly in the comments below. Which one of these 5 stories affected you the most, and why? If you enjoyed this true story and want more like it, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel. And if you're new here, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications, because in this world, they were never alone. And perhaps deep down, none of us truly are. I'll see you in the next video. Take care and stay safe out there.